and I'd really like to welcome you very much to this presentation, but I'd also like to take some time, if possible, in the end to discuss certain things that we looked at during the presentation, and also maybe get input from you how you would actually like to use ePortfolios in your own school. What I thought I'd do today with you is give you a brief run-through of why ePortfolios can be very useful in schools. My background is mainly from tertiary, so I worked at the university in Luxembourg before coming over to New Zealand in June. And so I've worked with using ePortfolios with students, mainly training them in the use of Mahara and also training teachers in the use of it and trying to see how we can implement that in a Bachelor in Educational Science program. And similar things also apply, of course, to schools. And what I would like to do is give you a brief overview of the different kinds of ePortfolios or portfolio work in general that are around and how they can be used in education. And then also give you an idea of how some people use ePortfolios, show you a few examples from students, but also from teachers. And then also give you an idea of how you can here in New Zealand use ePortfolio systems, specifically Mahara in the form of My Portfolio. Let's go that and set that some of you might have already heard of. So how many different types of ePortfolios are around? Well, quite a number, but I'm just going to talk about 4 of them mainly. And the first one that I'd briefly take a look at is the so-called showcase portfolio. That is especially a portfolio that can be used with younger kids or when you have youth that are leaving a school, because that is a portfolio where you really display the best work of a student. Or you can also use it, for example, when you apply for a job, even for you as teachers when you want to move to a different school or want to get into a different area altogether. That's when you usually use a showcase portfolio to really show off what you have done during the last years, to show your best work, to show everybody what you are capable of, what you have learned, and also what you can do for in the future. And different kind of portfolio is the reflective portfolio. As the name already says, what you do most in there is actually reflect upon what you have been doing, what you have learned, and that is usually the case when children are a little bit older and have also gone through critical thinking exercises and activities, and also just learned how to reflect. Reflection is something that we do constantly. We are also doing it at the moment. You reflect whether you should have come to this workshop or gone next door or stayed across the road, or whether you should have actually sat in the sun and enjoyed that nice day here in Auckland. But a lot of times we don't do that consciously. We usually do that unconsciously. And in a reflective portfolio, that's what you do. You bring that process to the front, make that the actual focus of an activity, so that you write down your thoughts on what you have seen, or you actually also videotape yourself, or you make an audio recording of it. And that's the main purpose of that type of portfolio, that you reflect on your activities. And for students, that could be reflect upon an assignment they had, and for your teachers, for example, when you've been to a PD training, you can write a blog post about it and not just summarize what has been said by the presenter or what you've done in the workshop, but also give your opinion about it, whether you're going to use it in your own teaching practice or not, and why you're going to employ it or why you're not going to use it. So the why is very important in there. Similar to the reflective portfolio is the developmental portfolio. There again, it is important that you do not just look at the end product, but also at the process. So the process plays a really big role in here, because you want to show where you started off and where you're going to finish, and also everything in between. So what we usually try to do with our students is get them into the process of really having a portfolio from year 1 to year 4 at university. And the same can also apply to students in your school, so when they enter secondary school until they leave school. And that is a number of years that they are at your institution. And so they could start with a portfolio already when they enter your school, and then at the end of one term or at the end of a school year, they do reflections on assignments or activities, actually also throughout that year. And in the next year, when they do a similar activity or come back to it, to the same project, or continue it, they can look back at what they've done the year before and then reflect upon what has changed in the meantime. So it's usually also for teachers and for becoming teachers important to look at their developmental process. For example, what you could also put into a portfolio is not only, as in a showcase portfolio, your best work, but you could also say, okay, I failed entirely in this class, and why did I fail with this classroom work that I've devised for today? And when you teach a similar class in a week or so, in your portfolio you write what you would have liked to change, and then 2 weeks later you have the opportunity to change it, and then you write another blog post or another reflective entry in your diary and say what you've changed and whether it worked out better than the first time. And there you can also include that into a developmental portfolio to show your principal or also to your fellow colleagues how something might work a little bit better at your school or for a particular student. And the last type of portfolio that I would just briefly like to mention is the assessment portfolio. And as the name already says, a lot of evaluation is involved, and for me that is the portfolio type that is closest to regular classroom work that you're already doing, because at the end the student gets a grade, even if it gets feedback, it's usually always connected to some type of grade. And that is a portfolio that becomes more and more important and is also more and more used, because more and more schools, not just in New Zealand but also overseas, realize that regular tests and exams aren't everything, but that the process of a student going through schoolwork should also be taken into account. But at the end, of course, you always need a grade to tell the student how he did at the end of the school year or just at the end of the class. And therefore, people have devised strategies of how to use portfolios for assessment purposes. And there, a lot of times, a rubric system comes into play. That is basically a matrix where the student also usually knows the rubric categories on which he is graded. So it's also a very transparent process. And later on, I'll go through some of the New Zealand curriculum statements that have especially been made in the pedagogy section, and we'll see how that actually also applies to portfolio work. So just to briefly summarize, we looked at 4 different types of portfolio: a showcase portfolio, reflection portfolio, developmental portfolio, and assessment portfolio. But as you can see on the screen, these portfolios aren't separate, but usually you have one type meandering into another type, and maybe in primary school you're going to start out with a showcase portfolio for the kids, which teachers then can actually do, while in intermediate school the kids move on to keeping their own portfolios and starting out with reflective work, whereas maybe also in secondary school then they use primarily an assessment portfolio or a developmental portfolio, but all the time also have some stuff in a showcase portfolio so that they can always show that to their parents or to their friends, or when they apply for an internship, that they can that show to a prospective employer. And therefore, the boundaries are really fuzzy, and a school, or maybe actually also a department or teachers themselves, can decide which type of portfolio they primarily focus on, but the other ones, of course, also always come in. And that depends also on the type of work you want your students to do. Because unfortunately, it doesn't work like that you say, student, okay, do your portfolio, and then they know what to do. But they need a lot of scaffolding as well, which we'll see in a minute. And now you might wonder, okay, that's portfolio work that can also be done in a binder, just by putting in pages that students turned in, exam papers, or just making printout of work. So why is there the E in there? And the E, standing for electronic portfolio, makes a lot of things, at least in my opinion, easier. Not necessarily all things, because how can I actually put a statue into my e-portfolio that I did during arts class? But at least what I can do is use more media types in my portfolio than just in a paper-based portfolio. So I can actually also put in entire video clips or an audio recording that I did. One of your colleagues has a flip camera here so that her colleagues who couldn't come can also see the presentation. So she could just upload that into her electronic portfolio and everybody would be able to access it from that one point. So she doesn't really have to make any copies of that video and hand it out on CD to her colleagues, but they can just use it. And the same thing goes for any other types that also the students do with their portfolios. Because in an e-portfolio, everything sits in a central space and the students just need to give access either to their teachers, to just one teacher, or they can also give access to their parents. And that's where the advantages of an e-portfolio system lie, because there you have better control over the permissions of who has access to the portfolio. Of course, some of you might already use Google Apps and Google Sites for student work, or use Blogger and WordPress or other blogging software to work with students and have them reflect there. But there it's usually a bit more difficult to say, okay, only this post is now for that person, and this post now can be seen by my class because that was a collaborative project. Whereas when you use an e-portfolio software, that becomes easier. And one of these e-portfolio softwares is Mahara. It has been developed here primarily in New Zealand for the last 3.5, 4 years. It started out as a project from Victoria University in Massey. So it did start in the tertiary sector, but pretty soon after the first version of Mahara came out of this open source software, schools also got interested in it because they saw the potential of using that as well. And Mahara can not just be used as e-portfolio system, but also as collaborative working space. So you can start, the students, but also you as teachers at a school, can create groups in there and work together on something, work together on a project that you're doing. In contrast to a learning management system like Moodle, KnowledgeNet, or Ultranet, in Mahara, nobody or no admin usually tells you which group can be created and which can't. On a learning management system, they usually have a course creator who has the hand on it and says, okay, that because that class exists here, it can also get an online course component. Whereas on Mahara, and especially also on my portfolio, the service that you can use, there the admin doesn't care. It's up to everyone themselves whether they want to create groups or not. And so there can be groups with just 2 people in it because they work on a small project in their school, but there can also be big groups in it that look at the New Zealand curriculum, at NCQA, or also just on very PD training opportunities at one school. And so that makes it very flexible and also more student-centered or learner-centered in general, because in a learning management, it's usually the teacher who says what has to be done, what assignments students have to do, in which discussion forums they communicate, which online resources they use. Whereas on Mahara, the student decides all that. The student decides what he wants to put into his portfolio. The student also decides who shall have access to it. And of course, over the years, that can change. Because when you work with primary students, they might not really know how to work with the system. So there's a lot of teacher involvement still in that portfolio process. So it might be that the teacher decides what gets put on it. Whereas when you move to intermediate and then especially as a secondary school, it's primarily the student and the learner deciding whom they want to give access to. But that doesn't mean that the teacher can't say, I need access to your portfolio, or at least part of your portfolio, especially if it's part of an assessment type work that they do. So this teacher still can say, okay, I want to see something, but he has to wait until the student gives him access. So there's no way for the teacher just to go into the student's own portfolio space and check upon the student whether he has already started on the work or not. But he only sees it when a student gives him access. So that is a lot of, we've done a lot around privacy issues, permissions, and also confidentiality. And that's what sets Mahara apart from other freely available online systems like Google Sites and blogging software, because the permissions can be controlled very easily. And now I'd just like to give you some examples actually of portfolios that were done by students and also by teachers and e-learning consultants, just to give you an idea of what a portfolio can look like. And with portfolio work, it is usually, as we can see from, or as you just heard, it's always that the student decides to whom he wants to give access, and therefore I can't show you all portfolios of all students that sit on any of our Mahara installations, because it would be a breach of privacy. Therefore, I'm dependent in presentations to show you examples that students made available freely online. So in this case, I don't have a New Zealand example, but an example from an American high school. But you'll see that, I have a different screen here. You see that the student here works with a lot of pictures, but also on her page, she reflects why she really liked the work in that particular English class. And so for the students, it becomes almost natural to use the reflection process and write down why they're reflecting upon it. So this is basically just a profile page. The student presents herself here with a lot of pictures of her friends and what she really likes, and then she also has some other portfolio work. Then we have some other portfolios. I'm sorry about the formatting here, but because the screen is shrank, we can't really see the entire video. But what you also see here, the student again reflects just a tiny bit on why she created the course, or this page and what she has done, and she even created a video which she put on YouTube. And what you can see here with the electronic portfolio is that you can put all different kinds of artifacts of evidence of learning on one page, align it where you want to have it, and of course also just click on the video and play it from there. So you don't have to just have a link in a Word file or somewhere else on the web page and go from there directly into YouTube, but you can display a YouTube video here. Also without downloading it, which is usually not very legal. So the student only links to the video, but can embed it, like in other social media applications nowadays, as that is possible. And she also has further links that go deeper into her portfolio. This student, that's a project that they did where they have an assignment on analyzing this piece of work. So it's not a profile page as with the previous two students, but really a project work that they did for this English class at Carmel High. And here the student just starts with the introduction also to the assignment, and then on the other pages they continue with the analysis, and they also have a photo story, podcasts, and of course also works cited. Yes?
As the teacher set that?
No, that's the student who set it up.
Their own assignment. So she's been given the assignment in a different form, and then she's made it into that form herself.
The teacher used Mahara for her entire course throughout the entire term that she had the students in the class. And so all the students' work are online, and they are also publicly accessible by anybody. So the assignment.
How did the teacher set the work in the first place?
I can tell you what the exact assignment was. I only know that I assume that the teacher said, okay, we have several topics in the class, assignments that need to be done, and you're going to use Mahara for that, presenting your work, presenting your final project work, and also using the website while they're working on the projects. So it wasn't an assignment that the students did on paper, or just typing it up on the computer and handing it into the teacher, but they were supposed to work with multiple media files, so images, is also a collaborative activity of the children. That means that they work together on these slides. And just one last bit of a student portfolio. In this case, we have a reflection of a student of his running activities, and he also put up videos. One video that is on YouTube, but another video he also uploaded directly to Mahara. And that is very good if, for example, if you have videos that cannot be shown publicly online, when you're filming kids or when you're filming teens and they don't want to have their video appear on YouTube, then you also have the possibility just to put it on Mahara and embed it in the same or in a similar way to a YouTube video, so that you still get the same result of being able to click on play and the video starts playing, while you're then also reading the reflection of the student. So you can have all the artifacts that belong to a portfolio side to side. Just a quick look at some portfolios done by adults. What adults usually use a portfolio for, in this case that is from Solent University, Samantha Moss. They use it for CV purposes, so you can build an electronic resume that you put online and either make available to anybody, or just use it within your school for professional development purposes, or also appraisal purposes. And what you can also do in our latest version is that you link pages, link a portfolio, which consists of several pages, so you don't just have to have one page for your portfolio, one website where you scroll all the way, but you can actually use a navigation bar and use that going from one space to the next. And what I also like about Mahara is that you do not only have to work in Mahara itself, but that you have the possibility, like the YouTube video, to link external resources and make them available there. So in this case here, I just bring in my blog from WordPress and make it visible in here. Although there is a blog functionality also in Mahara, because I started out on my other blog previously, I just keep it there and put the information in. So that is just the right-hand side, but I can also put it just Flickr photos, because that's another blog of mine, just a photo blog. And instead of doubling up the information, first on Flickr and then uploading it again on Mahara, which nobody really does after the second time because it's just way too much work involved when you always have to do things twice. So what you just do is link to the original source and just make it available in the e-portfolio. And that's something that becomes more and more important, especially when you use social media with your students. So you might use Prezi, a presentation software, or students might upload presentations to SlideShare. Or maybe you're already using VoiceThread, where you can have digital stories told. And when you do all that, you can't really do all that in Mahara. But what you can do is take that embed code from that external website and just put it into the e-portfolio, and then the students can write their reflection text around it, or also access their resources from within there. Okay, so just had these examples here, just again student portfolios, and I already showed you Samantha's. There's another portfolio, and you can again see he combined a CV with a video that he finds very important, and thus you can really personalize your own space. You don't have to look like everybody else. You saw that the students had different ways of presenting their text. Some used video, others more pictures, some were lively, others were more plain. And that's what you can decide of how you want to work with the electronic portfolio. Similar in a way you can do it with a paper-based portfolio, where you can also decide goes for ePortfolio software, where you can be quite flexible most of the time. Earlier on, I had already mentioned that it's not really good just to say, okay, student here, do an ePortfolio, but that it can be very helpful to actually have templates to encourage, to be able to do scaffolding with the students and to scaffold their work so that they have an understanding of where they can start and where they might have to be. And in this case, these are examples from Albany Senior High, just a little bit further up north. Mark Osborne is very active in ePortfolios. He uses My Portfolio with his students at the school, and there also teachers use it for appraisal purposes and to reflect on their PD sessions that they have. And this is a template they created for the students. So what the students can then do, they copy that electronic template into their own portfolio space and fill in the blanks. And that way they already have a structure there that they can follow for their portfolio, and maybe in 1 or 2 years' time they don't necessarily need that, but they know what they should put in there. And the templates can look quite different from each other. So in this case we have a table, and students again just fill in the blanks and make that view then available to their teachers. So I hope in some ways that you've already seen a bit how that can tie in with the national curriculum and how that can also apply to secondary schools. But just to go through some of the pedagogy issues there that were mentioned in the curriculum, namely creating a supportive learning environment. That can be done and should not only be done in the physical space but also in the electronic space, because students more and more have a digital identity. They are on Facebook, they might put videos on YouTube, they use Skype, they use Google Apps, they use Google Talks, and all these things. And so the physical learning environment also expands to the digital world. And therefore they also need to be made, they also need the support in there. And it shouldn't just be that there's a wall and then the teacher says, no, I'm not going in there. And having an e-portfolio and also being able to use collaborative work online makes it possible for the students to use the spaces they are already using the online world also in their schoolwork. And of course, encouraging reflective thought and action is quite simple for an e-portfolio, because a lot of times it just lives from reflection. But reflection for me is not just that the students reflect, but they also need responses. So it's very easy for teachers in Mahara to give feedback to a student's work and map that feedback to the view, to the web page that the student has created. Enhancing the relevance of new learning. There the curriculum also says that it's important that the students actually know why they're doing something. And in an assessment portfolio, for example, that can be done via the rubrics, because the rubrics are usually known to the students. Sometimes they even set up together with the students, and there they know from the beginning when they do an assignment how they have to do it so that they achieve a certain feedback level or a certain grade. And a lot of times when you take exams or quizzes, that is not the case, that students know exactly what they are graded on. And in this assessment portfolio, for example, that's very clear. There's not just one final grade, but the final grade consists of a number of feedback responses that are then accumulated into the final one. Facilitating shared learning is another aspect that ranks high in the national curriculum, and that can be easily done also in an e-portfolio, especially also Mahara, because students, as I said earlier, can create groups. And facilitating shared learning, and I think if I read the curriculum correctly, it does not only mention students, but also always mentions teachers in conjunction with students, having online learning or having learning communities. And they are not just communities of students, but also communities where teachers are involved. And teachers can have their own learning communities as well, because apparently we should have lifelong learning there somewhere into. And making connections to prior learning and experiences, that can particularly be done well in a developmental setting, and that is used for portfolio because they always look back at what you've done before and look at what you've these two things and see how you have progress. And a lot of times in the curriculum is also mentioned lifelong learning. And that also means it's not just student learning, but also when they go into a job, maybe also teachers, we should all continue learning and go to professional development workshops, go to conferences, but also just look over the shoulder of somebody in a staff room and learn from them. Learning is not always in a formal learning space, but also a lot of times and more often actually informal. Some people even say it's 80% that you do informal learning and only approximately 20% in formal settings like these or formal school settings. And therefore it becomes important just to be able to also track all these lifelong learning experiences. And that's what you can do by using a portfolio software. And the Ministry of Education has, of course, also seen the potential of lifelong learning and has recognized that it's very important. And therefore, they set up the hosted Mahara version, myportfolio.school.nz, which allows every student in New Zealand and also every teacher in New Zealand to have a login there once the school is registered. I also have flyers so you wouldn't necessarily have to type the URL from there. And with this hosted service, it is possible for students to start their portfolio when they're in primary school. When their primary school says, okay, we want to use portfolios. And they continue on myportfolio.school.nz until they leave secondary school. And then for those leaving, they can export the portfolio and then import it back into myportfolio.ac.nz, the tertiary version, which is basically the same thing, only that the universities pay a nominal amount and schools don't. That's why the sites are a little bit separated. But otherwise, it's the same system. And of course, because e-portfolios are not just there for students, but in a lot of ways, it is extremely important that teachers embrace it as well. That's why it's an e-portfolio just for students. I would always say capital letters, just shouting it out. No, definitely not. First, teachers need to know about it, because only then can they actually engage with the students and help them creating their own portfolios. Because if we as teachers, or even I as a presenter, don't know about portfolios and only tell you what I've read or what I've heard from others, then I can't really give you a good account on how to actually embrace portfolio work, because I wouldn't know how difficult it is. I wouldn't know how much fun it can be. I wouldn't know what to do with it. And therefore, I have my own portfolio. What I do most is blogging. So I try to do that regularly, but I also know that that is quite difficult. And so I don't just say it's a fantastic thing, but there are many, many issues also connected with it to make it such a nice thing that first need to be solved and that need to be addressed by teachers, by school, so that the students can actually also have a good experience. And therefore, it is often actually the teachers who need to know about portfolio work before they can start with it with their kids. Because otherwise, it just goes, unfortunately, not very well.
With knowledge.
It will be the case that my portfolio can be connected to KnowledgeNet and that it will be also supported with KnowledgeNet. At the moment, they still have their own portfolio, but the ministry, as my portfolio is the only supported portfolio software in New Zealand, or will be, that KnowledgeNet will also have to provide a link there and make certain information available so that you, for example, can have single sign-on and maybe also take some information from KnowledgeNet. Same goes for Ultranet and same also goes for Moodle. Moodle already has a single sign-on with Mahara because some Moodle developers became Mahara developers. And so that is already in a lot of ways taken care of. And also because Mahara and Moodle are both user softwares.
So what is my portfolio and your option to Mahara?
My portfolio is Mahara. It's just a hosted Mahara version for New Zealand. So it's the same thing. At the moment, it still runs on a slightly older version. It just runs on 1.2, but we are upgrading it to 1.3 advise you to go to My Portfolio because you wouldn't have to pay for anything. If you went with Mahara, the original version, which is open source and so can be installed by anybody on any server, then you would have to pay a technician, you would have to make sure that you're always up to date with the installations, apply security patches. Whereas with My Portfolio, you wouldn't have to worry about any of that at all because we take care of that. And the ministry supports it, and so there are no costs to you.
It's currently free. Is it going to stay free for secondary schools?
I can't say that because the ministry hasn't issued any information on that. It looks very good that because we are already at the end of the year, that it also be free if it's next year. But of course, the hope is that the ministry will save at least longer time frames of 3 years. But we haven't received that information. But I think it looks good. But even if it doesn't look good, or if you say no, if we want to install some more plugins, then you can install your own Mahara on your own school server, and student portfolios can be exported and teacher portfolios at any time. So you can export it from one version and import it into the other. So that is never the problem. As far as I know, that has to be discussed with Flexible Learning, Molecular Pacific, who gives support for that portfolio. But I think in a couple of cases where that has been the issue, the students have also been granted that they can stay on for some time. But it's as it's a free service to schools, it would be very easy for the schools to get access to it and allow the students to be in their institution and they continue keeping their portfolio.
So is it compatible the export with other e-portfolio software or just?
No, it is compatible with other commercial softwares as well, as long as these adhere to the LEAP 2A standard. So a LEAP 2A standard, it's a portfolio standard, and for example, Habitat has that, but not all other e-portfolio software. And then at least you can export it. It doesn't mean that it will look like Mahara on the other software, simply because that was quite a Blogger skills, no, because Blogger is Google and we don't yet have a connection there. What we are working on and that might come out in the next version is that we don't just support themes, but also skins so that students have more flexibility in making mistakes there. If you want to learn more about Mahara, because now we are also at the end of the session, you can sign up for taster sessions. I provided the link down here. It's just a short link that lets you go to the MLE reference group, which is a Google group online. And there you can sign up for a so-called Mahara taster session. That is a session for about 2 hours, where you go hands-on into Mahara, my portfolio, and play around with some of the functionality to actually get an idea of how easy or how difficult you find working in that environment. And you take your first steps, that's why it's called the taster, just to get a taste of it. It's not a full-fledged training, but just to give you an idea so that you can then discuss with your fellow colleagues whether you'd be interested in actually using that for your portfolio work. And how the taster session sign-up works, you put down your school, say how many people from your school would like to have a taster session, and then you also get together with other schools in your area. So it's not supposed to be a training just for one school, but kind of for cluster schools or also for an intermediate and a secondary there. And then the ministry coordinates who of the facilitators can come to you and do the training. And I hope to have shown you just a little bit of the different types of portfolios that are around, and also that it is important for teachers to embrace portfolio work, because all the different types that exist for student portfolios actually exist for any portfolio. So usually you can't really make the distinction between student and teacher, but a lot of times you also as teachers are in a student or learner role, And so, of course, then also the reflective portfolio, or maybe even the assessment portfolio, becomes important, for example, in appraisal processes. That can be a type of assessment or also type of development. And therefore, everything kind of applies to anybody who works with portfolios. But, of course, as teachers, I think we have also the role of helping your students get into the process of reflecting, get into the process of having a portfolio, to make it easy for them and to not have many boundaries there. How can you check what?
How can you check the authenticity of students' work without live courses?
That is still a question, and a lot of times you just have to believe them that they put their work up there, but Mahara is not made for an assessment portfolio. So at the moment we still focus more on reflective and developmental portfolios, and of course also use it for showcase portfolios. And therefore we have not put any measures in there that deal with authenticity or plagiarism, like some of the learning management systems can do already. But even if you upload work to Moodle, you can never really be sure that it's really the student who wrote an essay, or when we worked with Knowledge in the alternate, that it was really that student who did the work. There are many interesting devices around that try to cope with authenticity, so that you have a big video camera in front of you that also follows you around in the room and kind of gets activated when you just enter the room and things like that, just to make sure that it's really the person who that takes the assessment that is the actual person who is also involved in the course. But that's not the purpose of the learning that we do here. That is really only when you have online courses where it is imperative that you make sure that only that person takes a course or puts something up that needs to be under his level. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'll still be around till tomorrow in the afternoon. And of course, you can also send me an email or go to our website and try to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
School is saying, we haven't really been doing much, what do you call it, e-learning online, so we're very young. We have been using the edtech software,
And just
which is the